Welcome, everyone, to today's panel and discussion about publishing in the public humanities. I'm Mary Chapman. I'm the Academic Director of the Public Humanities Hub. I see that today's participants come from as far away as Vienna and Reykjavik, and as nearby as UBC Vancouver and UBC Okanagan. So welcome to you all. Thanks for coming, and thanks for taking the time to submit relevant questions that will inform our discussion. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the Hub and UBC are located on the unsurrendered traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam people. These lands were sites of learning for many generations before the University of British Columbia stood here, and we recognize our obligations as scholars and learners to ensure that the work we do upholds the best of that long-standing learning context. Today's session, organized by the Hub's graduate academic assistant and project manager, Sydney Lines, is part of the Hub's annual public scholarship series. This series includes presentations about a range of publishing activities that are intended to foster knowledge exchange between UBC and the public. We believe that with access to tools, methods, and resources, any humanities scholar can become a public scholar. These presentations reflect on the possibilities of genres within and beyond the academic article and the traditional monograph, through which humanities faculty and graduate students can share their research more broadly and participate in the reciprocity of community engaged work. In addition to the recorded presentations of events in this series, which are posted afterwards on the Hub's YouTube page, linked to our events page, Hub staff have also built public scholarship toolkits to assist in the skill building required to do this kind of work. So check those out. They're posted on our resources page. And if you'd like to hear about upcoming events in this series or the Hub's general programming, please sign up for our newsletter on our contact page. So now to today's panel. Today's panel brings together editors from different university presses in North America to discuss publication opportunities for publicly engaged work. Our moderator is Paige Raibmon, a professor of history at UBC with a long-standing commitment to collaborative and community-based research practice and a keen interest in new modes of research dissemination and scholarly output. In her role as editor of BC Studies, the British Columbia Quarterly, which is a peer-reviewed interdisciplinary journal, she's published regional scholarly work in print, audio, and multimedia formats. With Elsie Paul, Davis Mackenzie, and Harmony Johnson, she is co-author of the open access digital book, As I Remember It, Teachings from the Life of Sleeman Elder with UBC Press. I will leave it to Paige to introduce our panelists now.
Thanks, Mary. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you all here, and welcome to this wonderful panel that I'm sure is going to be very generative of all kinds of exciting ideas. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the three panelists all at the beginning now, and then they will each in turn have 15 minutes to share their comments and thoughts with you. So Darcy Cullen is Assistant Director of Acquisitions at UBC Press. She oversees the direction of UBC Press's editorial department and acquires manuscripts in Indigenous studies, gender studies, and across the press's imprints. She's the founder and lead of RavenSpace, project I know very well because I worked with Darcy on it for the inaugural publication, which was a real pleasure. And it's a new model of publishing that embraces collaboration, respects Indigenous protocols, and uses digital tools and imaginative ways to make knowledge accessible and shareable across communities and across generations. So after Darcy speaks, we'll hear from Teresa Mangum, a professor in the departments of gender, women's and sexuality studies and English and director of the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies at the University of Iowa. Mangum's research interests include best practices in publicly engaged scholarship and collaboration, 19th century British literature, cultural negotiations with aging, and between humans and other species. She recently co-directed a Mellon-funded initiative with Grinnell College called Digital Bridges for Humanistic Inquiry, and currently leads a Mellon project to design an interdisciplinary applied graduate degree called Humanities for the Public Good. With public historian Anne Valk, she co-edits the book series Humanities and Public Life for the University of Iowa Press. And then our third panelist is Siobhan McMenemy, senior editor at Wilfrid Laurier University Press and co-director of the Amplify podcast network. Siobhan has worked in scholarly publishing for 24 years, during which time she has built book lists and edited scholarship in the social sciences and humanities. She is committed to publishing scholarship by and about members of historically underrepresented communities. Her editorial work includes cross and interdisciplinary research, hybrid genres, and collaborative digital-born scholarship. Through her work on new forms of scholarly publishing, she hopes to contribute to the transformation of peer review practices in aid of equity, inclusion, accessibility, and collaboration. So you can see we have three wonderful panelists with a broad and diverse range of experiences. And with that, I'll turn it over to Darcy to start us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Paige. I will just share my screen. I have just a few images here. I'd like to thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank our hosts for organizing this event. And yes, of course, acknowledge our virtual presence on the UBC campus, which is on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam First Nation. I think I've been invited here today because of the connections between public humanities and community engaged and community driven scholarship. That's what I'll be focusing on today. And I'll start by introducing RavenSpace, which was launched a few years ago, but conceived, planned, and developed over almost a decade. It's both a platform and a model of publishing for interactive online publications in Indigenous studies. It was created really in response to a growing and pressing need for a more flexible format and to be more responsive to what Indigenous studies authors and audiences were asking for. As we know, the scholarly book is quite flexible and can take a lot of different forms, but its mainstay has become the single authored monograph. And a primary audience is scholars in the field, and then rating it outward with secondary and tertiary audiences, often maybe aiming for an interdisciplinary work or some crossover into the trade, but largely a big focus on that scholarly monograph that's facilitating conversations between and among scholars as a kind of a final work in of kind of the ultimate completion of a research project. With Indigenous studies, we really needed something different. We needed a different way also of thinking about publishing and how to publish. And part of this is in response to the wide array of materials and kind of multiple modes of expression. And so looking at ourselves, kind of how to free ourselves from the constraints of a very text-heavy, text-driven format, and thinking about storytelling traditions, oral history, geographic or place-based cues, performance, dance, games, and the relationships between institutional scholarly holdings and community-based heritage, knowledge, archival materials, and the juxtaposition of source materials with the analysis and knowledge. And so really thinking deeply about how to find a format and a way of publishing that would support this. And of course, also within that is the fact that a lot of these research projects were collaborative, working very closely with community and community driven, with a sense that this research was ultimately going to not only serve the conversations and push forward conversations in scholarship, but serve community needs, which can be very wide ranging and quite practical in their applications. And so as publishers, we were finding that there were liaisons, a scholar who was liaising during the publishing process. And so the question was, how could we support collaboration, co-authorship throughout the publishing process? And so what we've developed at RavenSpace, and I think which connects with a lot of public humanities community engaged work, is processes for that collaboration, co-creation, bringing in different kinds of skills and talents and crediting those, acknowledging their place in this ultimate sharing of that production of knowledge. And of course, with that comes what we technically call metadata, but it's contextual information, it's source information that can incorporate Indigenous knowledge systems, Indigenous information systems, also guidelines for preventing the digital decay as we're moving into an online environment and bringing different media formats together, different tools for audiences to reflect about Indigenous protocols for the use and sharing of cultural belongings. And then, of course, with the digital publication, the ability to shape contents in different ways for different audiences. So ultimately, the role of the publisher, as I see it, is very broadly to facilitate the flow of knowledge and ideas within and across spheres. And so supporting authors in reaching their goals for that form of communication, going beyond, after you've done your research, you've gathered your materials, you've defined a clear message, an argument, or a story to tell, and you need to know who you're saying that to now. And that's that point, that bridge now of communicating that. Who is it for? Who is the message for? How are you packaging it? How are you presenting it? What needs to be there? And this is where we come to provide tools and processes to help in that process. We have very high standards of care for the work. And part of that, an important component in hallmark and scholarly publishing is the process of peer review, which is sometimes seen or described as gatekeeping, but for me is really, and I think for most acquiring editors, is considered a part of the developmental phase of a work. And so there's that first manuscript or collection of materials and ideas and shaped into something cogent. And peer review is an opportunity to bring in someone knowledgeable, somebody with expertise who can comment on the work. And it's also somebody who is representative of that ultimate audience, who can kind of anticipate maybe what the needs of your readers will be. And so in peer review, there's usually comments about the contribution to the scholarship, but also the structure, the organization, the style, but a big focus on, is this an original work, the soundness of the scholarship, a vetting, a testing of the quality. So both from an expert's eye and a future audience member. And this brings a great rigor for which university presses are known. And so with this same commitment to rigor, quality, and excellence that's applied to conventional scholarship, with RavenSpace, we're applying it to community-driven digital works. And so having researched what would that look like, how can we expand the definition of peer review to be able to recognize expertise outside of academia, to recognize the expertise that many of you here in your work in scholarship are part of collaborating with others who are designated as cultural experts and knowledge experts in their field. With, as I remember it, as we see it here in this image, who is an expert on Elsie's teachings and stories, on her Tla'amin heritage. And so, where are we looking for that? And I can tell you more about this in the question and answer as can Paige as well. But that becomes the question is, who will tell us why this work is important, how it matters, whether it's sound. And so going into finding, broadening that idea of who is a peer. And then the other part, of course, is the presentation of format. You know, as you're moving into publication, you're thinking about the effectiveness of your communication. And so the being able to have an opportunity to review this with a group, to review this with others who are eventually going to use this, is incredibly valuable to understand how will this resonate with that community of users, that audience. How is it useful? How is it meeting their needs? And to be able to get that feedback and really listen, value that feedback and incorporate it, so that as you move forward in the completion of the work, you're bringing those ideas into it. You're considering really deeply, not only that you know, wonderful project of collaboration in the creation of this knowledge, but now really understanding the needs of those who are in multiple places. This is this broader reach, and really understanding and defining who are those groups, how will they use this, and so in this process, it's this iterative process of, you know, feedback and editing and feedback and incorporating that. And, you know, thinking about this panel in public humanities and digital scholarship, there's a lot of different formats and ways, and today is one of them, in the speaker series and scholarship panels, that we can talk and share our work with others. And it leads to the question, well, why publish? Why have formal publication? And there are many reasons for that, your own different motivations. You know, part of it is the quality that you'll see of production. In this case, a robust platform. You're not, you know, we're in a time of, you know, the ephemeral passing abundance of online material. There's also a huge question about what are the trustworthy sources. And so what we're trying to offer is a platform that is robust, that can anticipate legacy, long-term needs, particularly in this project around cultural heritage, but also generally this conversation of knowledge be able to carry through into the future and not decay or become, you know, disappear. And to have a robust system that's also integrated. I think something that can be overlooked is the channels of distribution. The idea of marketing and distribution really is a way of engaging and finding and discovering your audience, and for them to be able to easily find you. And so this is a bigger challenge for the new kinds of scholarship that we're doing, that we're publishing now, is being able to find those channels of more direct access, so that it's easier for you to engage with the audience, for that work to be able to be found. Typically, again, there's a closed circuit that's existed between authors, publishers, libraries, and now we're reaching outward. So what are those channels? If we're looking at museums or cultural education programs, community education programs, water governance discussions and plans, so there's such a breadth of application. And so it's something that we consider as publishers is, how are we going to connect? How are we going to find those new avenues and those new channels? And that's something we want to be able to do in collaboration with the authors. What are these communities of these groups that you're not only working with, but now thinking broadly that you want to communicate with? And so I do think that is both something we have expertise in, publishers, but also this is a challenge that solutions that we're looking for within, you know, in institutional infrastructure, but through partnerships and through the knowledge that you have about your communities of knowledge, communities of practice, and how you want to reach them very broadly. Oh, I also have, I brought an image of the analytics as well. But there are different ways that we can kind of measure interactions with our publications. Some of you will think about this more as a website, but this is really interesting to be able to look at, for as I remember it, we took a 2-year scope of this. And here we can see by region, the amount of people who are in BC, who are in Ontario, but also in New York, in Alberta. The list, we can tailor these in different ways. Understanding what devices they're using, which gives a really practical functionality of the formats that you're using. What days of the week, what parts of the year is this going into courses? Is this in K to 12? Is this moving into a policy environment? So kind of we're using different kinds of tools now to be able to think about the interactions and engagements that we're having with our audiences. So this is really just a quick overview of some of the publishing considerations as you shift from the research mindset to a publishing mindset, and start to think about the tools, but the bigger picture of the vetting process that can continue those engagements, and thinking about audiences and how to work with your publisher in doing that. In the Q&A and discussion, they'd be happy to talk about workflows and production, and show more about that if that would be of interest.
Thank you, Darcy. That's great and right on time. Teresa Mangum is our next speaker. So I'll just, Teresa, hand it right over to you.
Great. And let me get myself set up here. I don't know why, but I've got us. There we go. Okay. So thank y'all so much for inviting me. And you're going to hear a lot of overlap with Paige. It's so exciting to learn about your series, Paige. And we do share philosophically many points in common and practically. So the Humanities and Public Life series at the University of Iowa Press that I co-edit with Annie Valk, who's an historian at CUNY and runs a public history center there. We started this series for a very pragmatic reason, and that was so many of the great people we knew who were doing public projects were, and Paige suggested this, were not slowing down to document those projects. And we live in a world in which if you are in certain kinds of careers, you still need particular kinds of documentation. For humanities scholars, often a book. And so we really wanted to try and help scholars who are out doing these amazing projects get promoted, get tenured and promoted. And there, in many universities, that was going to be very difficult to do without a book. So we had that very pragmatic ambition. Now let's see if I can get my up. Oh, there we go. So for the goals for the series, we wanted to do several things. We wanted to document innovative, sustained projects. We wanted to help people provide a full unfolding account of the many dimensions that public scholarship has. As a lot of us know, those categories of service, teaching, and scholarship just start blurring immediately when you're in a really interesting public project. We wanted a space where people could talk frankly about the challenges, about their failures, and what they learned from those failures, as well as their successes. We wanted to help people share best practices for university community partnerships. We knew that people needed help, and Paige was alluding to this too, with providing both evaluating their own work and providing a basis for sharing and evaluating the impact of public projects on multiple arenas, on the public partner and their work, on public more generally, at universities, in disciplines, all sorts of different ways of thinking about that, about evaluation. And finally, we just wanted some really inspiring projects to encourage people to think about how to do this work and the variety of kinds of work. I'm just going to take you through very rapidly a series of projects just to give you a sense of the breadth of the series. And I'll admit to you in the challenge category that one of the things I actually envy Paige, the coherence of focusing on Indigenous work, because we are open to people who are doing any kind of project in the humanities broadly conceived But then what that means is every book has to be marketed so to a whole different audience. And, you know, I'm sometimes deeply envious of the contemporary poetry book series at Iowa Press because they've got their list. This is not such a challenge, but it's also a great way to learn about a lot of fields. So the Penelope Project was one of our first, and Basting is an amazing performance artist, theater person, a writer, playwright, and also a scholar of aging. And this was one of the books that introduced us to the challenges, and that we have this listed as edited by and co-wrote the book with a whole series of collaborators because it felt very uncomfortable to claim authorship for this particular public project. So we learned that we were going to have to take into account the multivocality of public work. And another interesting thing about this book was that we first fantasized that we were going to have chapters and inner chapters by students involved in the projects, by the community partner, which was a retirement community, and one that included many people dealing with dementia. Well, obviously that did not lend itself to each person writing their account of the experience of being part of the practice. But we also realized that in the same way that asking us as scholars to be certain kinds of representatives in public spaces, we might not be the best fundraising voice for a dementia supporting organization. And this, in the same way that asking a student or a care worker to write a chapter of a book that is in part an academic book wasn't asking them to do their best work for us. And so we started realizing we're going to have to come up with some strategies to include voices. And this was one of the books where we used really interesting edited interviews that I think often is a more respectful way to represent multiple voices than just directly ask people to write. This is also a book that ended up being paired with a public television documentary. It just happened that Anne's partner is a documentary filmmaker. And so that's been a really interesting double life for the project. Another project in New York City involved a very complicated coordination of groups working to try to renovate and save the older buildings of a community. And so suddenly we had to think about planning and design elements. That was really interesting. So we had to rely more heavily on photos. See You in the Streets, most of you know about the Shirtwaist Triangle Factory fire, in which numerous people who had been, women especially, and immigrants had been locked into seamstresses into a building in New York and in the early 20th century, and ended up leaping to their deaths because of a fire. And this is a chalking project all over the country. How do you capture that? How do you capture that history? How do you capture all the artifacts that Ruth Sturgill started collecting from family members as a way to honor these workers? So again, we had to really think about, how do you tell a story? How do you weave in union voices, for example, into a project like this? How do you avoid writing a how-to book? It's very tempting to say, here's the chronology of what we did, and here's how you could do it in your community, when what we really wanted was to save the best of the humanities of interpretation, reflection, and mediation, as well as documentation. That's proven to be a really interesting challenge. We've only published one collection of essays, and I hope that we will be able to do that again in the future. Academic presses are go in and out whether they are comfortable with collections of essays, although I think it makes a lot of sense if you want teachable volumes where you figure out a way that's financially viable to let people choose a few essays they want to use. And this was a way to remind all of us that you can do public scholarship with literature, archives, projects from the 18th century, from earlier periods. I think a lot of people are really worried that public scholarship is very presentist, and this great anthology proves that to be untrue. We then have had several books in which, 2 books especially, that are about thinking about how to capture very nuanced, complex projects that are dealing with descendants of slaves and people who were enslaved, and thinking about how to open conversations in tough places like Alabama and Mississippi around those issues. Jody Skipper's an anthropologist who realized that in her community, every year they had tours of plantations and they never mentioned slavery. They were talking about the architecture of a plantation house and the gardens. And, as a Black woman and a Black scholar, this was just stunning to her. And so she and her students talked a few of the owners of these houses into letting them do sort of counter tours in which they talked about Black life in those plantations, the history of slavery, the outbuildings that remained. And this has turned into a wide community project that addresses these very tough issues in ways that allow a lot of students, including white students from small communities in the South, to be part of racial reckoning in communities. And they now are thinking about this as a kind of national project that could be adapted to different locations. One other project that was really wonderful, Rhonda Thomas was introduced to Clemson as a new faculty member by being invited to go to a museum that turned out to have been the founding plantation in this community. Again, that focused on the history of Clemson, but not its history of Black labor, prison labor. And so she worked with a number of descendants of those laborers, many of whom still work at Clemson, everywhere from the classroom to the cafeteria. And this was a project in which Rhonda was very adamant that she needed to include voices of students and descendants. And so she developed a very creative form of interchapter commentary that let her weave a lot of the voices of people who'd been crucial to this history project into her volume. And then our latest book is by 2 people in theater who have been going around the country working with city councils to stage what a city council meeting looks like, reversing the counselors as audience and public audiences as counselors, to raise awareness that real politics happen at very local levels. And that when we focus only on national elections, we've already given away so much potential power and participation. So I just wanted to give you that feel for the different kinds of projects people are writing about. And very quickly to wind up, our collaborative process, I'm so interested in hearing about Paige's process, because it sounds like working on public projects forced us as editors to think much more collaboratively. And that's honestly what we love about this series. So whereas in a typical academic book, you might chat with an editor a little bit, but you submit a formal proposal, you get invited then perhaps to send a couple of chapters, and then you submit a manuscript that goes out to readers. We really think of ourselves as collaborators with our authors. So as soon as somebody tells us they're interested in that idea and we think it resonates with the series, we schedule a phone conversation, the 2 of us. We have wonderful conversations, make suggestions, warn people about this problem of just creating a chronology or a how-to book and how to think about that differently, how to think about audience for this series that is not just for academics. And then we invite them to submit a proposal. They get feedback from the editors. And then we have a conversation. Again, it sounds a lot like Paige. If we're limited to a book because we're trying to help people do what a book can do specifically, but within those constraints, how do we think about form and content? How are you going to bring in those voices? How are you going to use images? What could you do differently? If authors want to, we'll read chapters right along with them. we find that people often have to do some reframing 2 or 3 times to get to a representation of their project that is not a how-to book, but really a deep reflection with advice. We think about the feel of the book, how to include voices that need to be included. The books go out for peer review exactly as a normal academic book would, but we work with the authors on what they want to take from that advice. And then we really try to work with them to imagine uses and ways they want to engage with the audience, which for a print book is harder than one might have suspected in this day and time. And I also wanted, before I wind up, just to remind you of one other place to publish. The organization Imagining America, Artists and Scholars in Public Life, is very dear to my heart. And they have an online journal that is so creative and interesting and is very collaborative also, and also peer-reviewed, called Public. And so I would encourage you, especially those of you who are graduate students, this can be a great place to get started and to start with an idea that you know you want to develop into something more fully. So I think that thinking about that staging of how to report out on projects can be helpful. And just to give you a sense of the variety of the topics that Public has taken up in recent years, just a little bit of screen share. And then, you know, we are happy to hear about your projects. So I'll also make sure that I drop my email in chat, but we are always happy to hear about your ideas, and can't wait to see what's on the horizon for public scholarship. So I'll stop there and let me undo myself. There we go. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. That was fascinating. I love learning about your book series. And I'll just quickly clarify that it was Darcy who was talking about.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. It's wonderful to get to be, you know, credited with all of that. So
I'm so sorry, Darcy. Thank you.
Just so that the audience is clear. And I realized too that I've inadvertently, I think, switched the speakers as well from the agenda. So Siobhan, you're next, and thanks for your patience and bearing with me on that, everybody.
Thanks very much, Paige, and thanks to everyone else for their presentations. So far, there's something about coming third of 3. It means I run the risk of sounding like a broken record. How's that for an old-fashioned tech reference? I'm going to try to adjust my plans for speaking on the fly, just because I would like to avoid a whole lot of repetition. And also I'd like to anticipate prospectively some of the questions that we may all receive in the Q&A, because I know some people in attendance are interested in careers, which I think leads in some ways nicely into what I would like to talk about, which is what I have learned as an editor in university press publishing, doing the work that I have been doing for the 6 or 7 years now on scholarly podcasting, because one of the joys of being an editor in scholarly publishing is that your education never ends. You are exposed, as my fellow panelists have duly noted, to all kinds of academic research and conversations within academia and outside in communities of various kinds. And one of the real joys in working, and I hear it with the other speakers, in working in areas of new scholarly development or new modes of expression for scholarly research, is that it's an opportunity to have a bit of fun, to play with conventions, to reevaluate and reflect on the strengths and the weaknesses of some of the conventions that we have, as press editors, have been taught to follow and maybe not encouraged to think about. But I've been doing this now long enough that I feel like I've earned the right to question it all. So the real pleasure of working with my primary collaborator, Hannah McGregor, who is an SFU scholar in the publishing program, is that I will avoid the expletive, but she is she is a disturber of the status quo. And I'm happy to participate in that kind of activity myself. And at the heart of our work is a real drive that we share in finding new ways to present scholarship that really do all the things that we have already heard my fellow panelists talk about, to enrich scholarship as a collaborative process, as a generative process, as experimental and creative. And podcasting is also a uniquely variable form insofar as scholarship is concerned, because we are not collectively all that used to turning off our screens or closing our books and listening to scholarship. So podcasting necessitates a different kind of engagement that, you know, we talk about when we think about an academic conference, for example, or an event like today's, where we're all listening, but it would be antisocial of me to turn off my camera, even though I was tempted to do so and to suggest, well, you could close your eyes and not worry about the visuals, but to just listen to what is being said, because it exercises our brain differently and it encourages a different kind of response. And that kind of response to scholarship presented in an audio format really underscores the emotional. It also underscores the physicality through sound, the embodiment of the voice of the scholar, something that is very hard to convey on a page, though we of course talk about the writer's voice on the page. In addition to having this form that is of course widely popular, you know, recognized as all kinds of legitimate, and as a sort of subsequent generation to work like radio work, it hasn't been peer reviewed in any particularly focused manner. There are growing numbers of people, myself included, who continue to experiment with the way we peer review podcasts. And there are also now people who are experimenting with using the podcast as a means to peer review, precisely because it underscores the collaborative nature of the dialogue that we hope to achieve in peer review. Even though the conventional form is a written report, it is more often than not a process that is one-way anonymous, meaning that the author may be known to the reviewer, but the reviewer's identity is not known to the author, which of course inhibits conversation. And so the work that I've been doing over the last number of years has been trying to underscore opportunities for us to rethink the way we conduct peer review, even when we're talking about peer reviewing conventional forms of scholarship. And so the work that I began with was an experimental pilot scholarly podcast that was Hannah McGregor's Secret Feminist Agenda. And we were the beneficiaries of a SSHRC fund, a SSHRC research grant that allowed us to relieve the sort of worries of paying for time and for publishing something that has to pay for itself, but instead to invest in expanding our concept of what scholarship looks or sounds like, and how to make it count, or to give due credit for it, and how to turn the concept of the scholarly podcast into something viable for further development and exploration after our work on this pilot podcast, which then kind of naturally led us to a second project, also SSHRC funded, which was to develop a scholarly podcasting network called Amplify, and to undertake the development of 3 new scholarly podcast series with our collaborators. And all of this, I'm not going to share myself on the screen because I'm trying to honor the audio, but instead, there'll be links, I gather, so that you can follow this information yourselves now or later. But at the heart of this work, as I think exists at the heart of the work we've already heard about today, is the question of how we create knowledge, and then how we choose to honor the means with which that knowledge was created through different methods of dissemination. And one of the things that I discovered in the course of experimenting with peer review was that there was at once a push and a pull toward wanting to peer review a podcast series. One of the things that we are responsible for as university press editors is being responsive to the calls of our community, principally academics, but not exclusively. And what I was hearing over and over again is that there's all kinds of work, as I'm sure my colleagues have too, all kinds of work happening that isn't being seen. It isn't discoverable. It isn't rooted in the convention of peer review as yet. It isn't on the radar, and therefore it isn't counting. And podcasts have a history of being produced by very scholarly people with very scholarly aims, and receiving accolades of the sort that underscore the pedagogical purposes of a podcast, as opposed to the potential of a podcast making a contribution to scholarship. So that, we determined, was one of the things we wanted to try to explode in the course of developing a network where scholarly podcasters could present their work, by devising a system of peer review and publication that would make it more readily discoverable, and that would additionally, if the podcaster so chooses, have the benefit of a formal peer review conducted by a university press. So the Amplify network will be launching a call for presentations fairly soon. But you'll be able to find guidelines on the submission of the proposals on the website. And you will be able to, in due course, everything is sort of unfolding in real time. In due course, you'll be able to review various completed peer review processes on that same website to get a sense of the kinds of engagement you can expect if you decide to go with the peer-reviewed process. So there will be, in fact, 2 streams of podcasts in the network, one peer-reviewed and one not. I don't want to go on too much because I would really like to just sort of open things up, if I may, to the Q&A. So I'm, as with my fellow panelists, I've got lots I can say, and I know there are questions that will help me work in some of the material I was going to bring in to the discussion in any case. So if I may, I'm going to just stop talking and let others guide us so that we can have a more collective conversation about these various matters.
Thanks, Siobhan. That was great. I love hearing about that. So I think Sydney is going to handle some questions that sort of move them forward as they come in through the chat. And I'm going to start us off with some questions that people submitted ahead of time. Some of the attendees had a chance to submit questions they were interested in hearing about ahead of time. And one of the issues that kind of circulated through some of the topics that the attendees were interested in relates to an issue that is a thread through all of your presentations. So each of you or any of you could speak to this. And that's the relationship between these kinds of public-facing projects and their potential to remediate help resolve, move forward the dilemmas and problems with justice, equity, diversity, accessibility that tend to already be part of, they're part of the world. And so obviously they're part of academic publishing in particular ways. And so it would be great to hear a little bit about the particular ways that you're kind of taking that on in your projects. And my own little request or twist on this that really strikes me as so interesting is that each of your initiatives that you spoke about today, each one of them advances or values, makes visible the process of producing knowledge and scholarship as part of what is then evaluated or valued. And I wonder if that's part of how these projects help us create scholarship that's more equitable, inclusive, etc. Any of you can speak to that, and if all of you want to, that would be wonderful.
Maybe Darcy could start, because the process of the collaboration and review just seemed so creative and interesting.
I'd be happy to. I think one thing I should mention is in developing what's now called RavenSpace, and producing the first publication and building the platform, I've come to describe that process as walking alongside in order to create these kinds of changes. And we had to build on what we knew, the expertise we had, our purpose, as publishers. That's what people were looking for, is to bring this. We also had to look at borrow models to say, well, what is happening on the web? What are these digital workflows or processes or concepts that we need to learn about? And of course, first and foremost was we need to be learning from our authors and community. And so it really was that process of walking alongside that I think, Siobhan, when you say being a lifelong learner, I think that really resonated with me, because I think a big part of doing this is to know that your expertise has to join up with someone else's in order for you to grow and develop and make change. And so that a big part was listening. And so also understanding the purpose of what we do, so that we can look at what is the potential, what are the possibilities, so that they're not ossified. And so recognizing what are the metrics, in community, what do they use, what are Indigenous people valuing from the publishing process? So who is speaking? What are the roles? How can we reflect those roles, as opposed to maintaining a hierarchy of single authorship or that idea? So how do we bring in multiple creators? How do we rethink, not thinking just what is peer review, but what is that vetting process? What is the purpose of that process? And so really stepping back from the articulation or the way we do things, and stepping back is, what's the point of that and what is it serving? And then being able to be wide open to saying, how would you do this? What will work for this project and for your goals and aims, and to bringing that into it. So I think it's being able to just have a conceptual openness, as opposed to trying to stay close and kind of as though there's like a safety or standard that is sacred or immovable, and really know that there are other ways of creating best practices and recognizing them. It's quite general. I could maybe talk about some specific examples, but as a whole, as an approach, that was what we took.
And I'll just add quickly, in our case, part of what I have found fascinating, I love forms like the sonnet, where you have a fixed set of possibilities, but you're stretching them in every way you can, that tension, and the decision to go with a published academic book format, and then to work with authors and with the designers at the press, acknowledging the reality of cost that any variation on a traditional book can impose. That's been something we've tried to make playful instead of frustrating. And it has, we think of it as our sort of Trojan horse strategy, that as opposed to what would be delightful, which is just, and I do in other areas, which is just to leap outside of the academic book. And, you know, I take such pleasure in your comments about podcasts and other digital formats, and love to see people use those. But when a book will serve a person in a community well, how do we start kind of reworking books from within in this collaboration with authors, editors, and the wonderful experts at the press?
I think it's worth noting that we all work with books as well as the work that we're talking about principally today. And I would miss the book if we suddenly were told, okay, well, the podcasting, for example, is where it's at, so just do that all the time. I would not be happy. But you know, I was thinking about what each of you has said, Teresa and Darcy, and in addition, the question about inclusivity. You know, one of the things that is that Darcy may not have spent as much time as she'd have liked talking about with respect to RavenSpace is that there's an audio component. So it's a beautifully designed web space with audio. And one of the things that we have heard from Indigenous podcasters and scholars is the thing about the podcast is that it centers the oral. And for Indigenous scholars, one of the massive frustrations is that the oral tradition is not given due respect in terms of tenure and promotion, for example. And to be a part of producing work in new formats that gives room and due attention and the benefits of peer review and the imprint of university presses to oral expression is extremely important. The other thing that we've been doing with the peer review process for the podcasting is experimenting with open peer review, which of course is not our creation, but was the first time I, as an editor, was able to experiment with an open peer review process, which meant that I have learned an awful lot about the values and the pitfalls of open peer review. But open peer review, one of the real benefits of it is that it invites collaboration in an even more meaningful and ongoing and to some degree iterative way between podcaster or scholar and the reviewers. And I certainly know as a years-long book editor that there has always been when an author gets a particularly constructive and helpful peer review, there's always this urge to talk to the reviewer more and to have that conversation. So in an open peer review or in a conversational peer review, which takes an audio form, you get that. You get a sense of immediacy. You can have a conversation. You know, you're free because everyone knows who everyone else is to have discussions even without the press editor present. So there's a level of accountability that brings a greater readiness for collaboration, I think, with open peer review. And then the last thing I just wanted to touch on briefly is that one of the big things that the Amplify network is devising is a podcast preservation tool, which will be an open source tool when it is fully formed and ready to be released into the world, that will help podcasters to ensure that their work is sustainable and discoverable. And the tool is being devised so that you can upload the audio files, of course, but also any images that are necessary, transcripts, which makes the audible available for people with hearing impediments. There's a whole degree of or in a range of understanding of accessibility that tool will bring to scholarly podcasters fingertips. And so we're really excited about the launching of that tool in due course as well.
Maybe I could pick up two of the themes, Siobhan, that you mentioned there. And you talk about voice and accountability. And I think one of the things that we haven't talked about is, we've talked about peer review and tenure and promotion, is we're very much a legitimating press, or publishing entities as university presses. And so we lend that legitimacy, that credibility to the work. And so I think it's something we have to admit. And so when authors are coming to us and publishing, what we are able to do, or they are able to do by coming to University Press and using this imprint, is bring that knowledge into the public record, into the scholarly record. And so that means you're not creating these isolated pockets of knowledge that are held. You're bringing that into this record and creating greater opportunity for quality and legitimation of that voice that is self-legitimating, and then being able to assert that in these different spheres. So I think that's something we really should recognize, that we have that position. And then going back to that question of peer review is seen as also a method of accountability to those standards. And so if we think about a community review or an open review, we're really opening up, who are you being accountable to? So it means that, again, these priorities that have been set about who gets to be in charge of that, who are you being responding to? Is it the TNP committee exclusively, or now are we saying no, you're accountable now to the Tla'amin leaders, the Tla'amin community, the broader Indigenous community in their own projects and works. And so it offers up a lot of possibilities if you start to think about the role that the function of publishing in University Press and each step along the way. In terms of accessibility, I also want to say that questions of web accessibility is still very new. A lot of things that we're doing are new, and so what we're always doing is a kind of anticipating. So it's the idea that we're hoping to reach that standard. We're working to get to that standard, and so we're never fixed. We're never saying we've got the best practices. I think what we're seeing is we're trying to get there, maintain that, and really think creatively. And that's where it's quite generative. It's quite exciting to think that we can participate in pushing these tools further because we're hearing the needs and we're bringing those needs forward. And so again, it's like having the ability to do that. And so as authors, as you're coming through and thinking about that, this is the opportunities that you have to really shape what publishing can be.
And I just want to toss in one more resource that you just made me think about. I don't know if you know this project called the Humetrics Project, Humane Metrics for the Humanities and Social Sciences. This is a wonderful, wonderful Mellon-funded project led by Christopher Long, who's a philosopher and dean at Michigan State University. And they have a toolkit online that's really great. And the way you use the toolkit is you bring groups of people together and work through a series of conversations to decide what are your shared institutional values, and then to decide what kinds of work would get you to those institutional values in order to decide how you want to think about what counts and how to value work. And this conversation is making me think it would be fascinating to use that Humetrics approach with a press board or with the collective of people involved in these kinds of projects we're doing, to give everybody from reviewers to editors to some of your authors this shared sense of we should think together about what our values are for the series or how we work together, and then we should think about how to mark and respect to those values and build them into the evaluation system. And oh my goodness, wouldn't that make peer review a more humane system across all of our institutions and professional societies?
Thanks, everyone, for all those thoughts. Maybe I will, if somebody has a question and wants to raise their hand or type it in the chat, feel free. Maybe while we just give that a second, I'll just add something about the peer review process that Darcy was talking about that we used for As I Remember It. And it's another aspect that I think poses a potential, I think, very productive challenge to academic notions of expertise, because it also wasn't a peer review process that was generalizable. So it came from the main author, from Elsie Paul, and it was really a peer review process that was rooted in Obermann governance practices. So it was tied to notions of copy, what in academic language or Western language we might call copyright. So who owns that knowledge in the Obermann community, and what steps need to be taken to make sure the person speaking or publishing has the authority and is telling a version that is hers to tell, which is part reflected in the title of the book. So that peer review process was community focused, as Darcy noted, but in a very particular way as well, that was family driven. So Elsie identified the living representatives of the different families who hold knowledge in the community, and we brought them together in order to have their input on not the final product of the book either, but kind of something like pretty close to the wireframe, so that they could sort of say, like, not just the content, but like, here's how, recognizing the really tight relationship or the interrelated relationship between the form of the book and the information it would contain, so that that peer review process happened at a really different stage as well than you would maybe normally see with a written text-based book. So I don't see a question in the chat, and I don't see a hand. So I'm going to ask another question of the panel that's connected to what came in ahead of time. And this builds on what Darcy was saying about these questions of legitimation and all of you touched on this in different ways, that the university press imprint can give to novel forms of scholarship. And there were a number of people asking questions in particular about junior scholars, untenured scholars, what the feasibility is for, we could extend it to graduate students, because there's a huge amount of interest among graduate students, and maybe I expect not very much support from a lot of committees in terms of graduate students support pursuing projects like this. And so if any of you could speak to that, and I guess in particular, what I hear implicit in that question has to do with the pace of publishing, the time it takes and the care to do this work, and also some of the funding challenges or models that, Mellon is a great supporter of a lot of these projects, actually. But what's the long-term kind of sustainability for funding? Do scholars need more money than if they were pursuing a print book? Do you see the grants and things out there sustaining these projects in the way that's going to be needed to make them sustainable?
Well, one quick thought is your question suggests that probably we all need to learn. I feel like people in the humanities have so much to learn about grants and grant culture, because basically we applied for fellowships to do projects, and a lot of us haven't, many of us are newly understanding other kinds of grants. But writing into a grant for a public project some funding that's set aside to support the documentation of the project, that might be a good analog with the way certain grants in other fields just expect you to ask for $10,000 for evaluation. And maybe that we need to push for that $10,000 that you can ask for evaluation really being also about documentation and the support you need to get work done. And the other thing I've thought a lot about with partners scholars who have been writing for us, these projects are so different from other academic books in the humanities to me, because people who are writing academic books, they'll often spend 5 years, 10 years doing research. The people who are doing these projects, that is the research. They're living their research. So it's more about finding some space and time for them to just write what has already been accumulated. So it's really a different place in a process. And, I tell our writers, writing a book does not have to take 5 years or even 1 year. It's you think more like a journalist. You've got a great project. The world needs to know about it. How could you think differently as a writer than the ways many of us were conditioned to write by our graduate training? So I hope that's not a shocking thing to say, but it's what I see.
I think it's encouraging to know that people are receiving the kind of advice that encourages them to write differently. Having said that, I would want to underscore how challenging that call is for people who are at the beginning stages of their career, because of course we all know, excuse me, they get the biggest classes to teach. They aren't necessarily even on a tenure track. They have all of the committees foisted upon them and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure there is a straightforward or easy answer to your questions regarding funding or timeline or other complications, but certainly in terms of the costs and the sustainability of these creative undertakings that publishing houses are currently overseeing or collaborating on, funding really is a very important and troubling aspect of what we do, because there tends to be a level of enthusiasm for the new, and we've been certainly very fortunate and grateful for the funding that we've received. The funding that we receive as a press for our books is finite. The funding that is available to academics for experimenting is finite. So it seems to me that the real issue is that we all have to work collectively to advocate for the work that we are currently already doing, and that these same granting agencies have seen fit to support, so that we can encourage them to build into their funding mandates pockets of money devoted to unconventional scholarly dissemination, not at, I would hope, at the expense of more conventional, but to encourage the even more expensive experimenting that we're trying to do and to sustain over the long term. It's true that certainly with my work on podcasting, the conversations around funding tend to return time and again to my offering to help with the application process to a research grant, and into which we build a sum that will help offset some of the upfront costs of producing a podcast series, because we have no way as a press to recover any of those costs that we are dedicating to their production, because we don't sell the podcast once it's published. It's an open access publication. And so the conversation is exactly the same, at least in my experience, as the conversation about publication subventions for book publishing. We need to ensure that universities recognize the value of the presses, that the various funding agencies available to us, wherever we may be, understand the value of the university presses, and that they are underfunded. And therefore, collectively, we need, as scholars, as editors, as publishers, to work to achieve a sustained source of funds for this kind of work, or else we're going to presumably, I hate to be dreary about it, but scale some of this back. And I you know, plus ça change. We these conversations, they don't stop, and so I think the only way to sort of amass a real movement toward fixing this problem of underfunding is to work collaboratively. Surprise. and advocate for it.
And one of the other things that I've really tried to kind of discipline myself into thinking about is after being the very grateful beneficiary of several Mellon grants, is I've seen all around the country the way that grant funding is a really interesting double-edged sword, because you get addicted to that funding and you build projects on that extra funding that will end. And so I've tried to start really thinking about using grants to build structures that will endure, which means they have to be situated in parts of the institution ready to take to ownership. And that is, to me, one of the ways I make that case for some of the public work at Iowa is to say, I want the humanities to live everywhere, not just in the academy. And so I want our graduate students to have the experience to learn skills and to translate their academic research and work into all kinds of workspaces. And that is part of being responsible as a graduate hosting institution in this day and time, given the scarcity of academic jobs, but also given what people want to do with their lives. And so I think at the same time that we want to think about grants for exactly actually the reason Siobhan points out, which is that grants are going to go to the new latest thing most of the time. They're not going to sustain efforts. So we have to be simultaneously reaching for grants and also figuring out how to build structures that will make these activities part of the regular fabric of our work and budgets, if we want them to endure.
That's a great point. Those are all great points. And I'm optimistic about the kind of the recognition of this work. I've had people from different universities contact me to ask about, our peer review, to ask about our standards, because they are looking at reevaluating their own measures of what constitutes a scholarly work and how it's rewarded in tenure and promotion. So I think that there's a recognition of change in scholarship and what it is. Also, again, speaking to graduate students and emerging scholars, you are the future, and you are recognized and seen as the future. And so there really is an interest in looking at, well, what is the work that you're doing? What is that projecting? What is that telling us about how the institution may need to change? There's also a desire to make knowledge more public. And so, I think this is a really important point, to be able to think about how we connect our work that we're doing to what's already built into the institution, or what is being built into the institution. And certainly that requires an effort of advocacy. And I would say that timing is a tricky issue, because when you apply for grants in Canada, there's this kind of, usually this section on dissemination, which kind of assumes that the scholar is responsible for dissemination. But then there are other funding opportunities that allow for something different. And I think research and publishing we need to start the conversation early, but I think being able to get to the nuts and bolts of what your publication is going to look like is a bit like being able to, in that application, say, I know the conclusion of my research. So I think it's a fundamental kind of workaround that we operate with when we try to embed some money into a research grant that's actually for publishing. And I think as publishers, we try to advocate for the fact that publishing is is its own journey and its own step, and it needs to be funded. And so at the moment, having more conversations around that, I think, would be very valuable. It would shed a lot of light on how we're seeing the kind of the cycle of knowledge, how it's produced, how it's published, and then how it flows back into new productions. And so, and hopefully it's not that circle, hopefully it's going outward, but a better understanding of how we're seeing that, I think, would be helpful.
Thanks, everyone. I've got a question now from the chat from Heidi, who thanks you so much for your talks and discussion. She's a PhD candidate who's interested in editing after graduation. So she's wondering, could you share a little about how you navigated your career path into editing, and what you'd recommend for PhDs who are considering these kinds of careers now, assuming these careers survive all the things you've just been talking about.
Well, I can say a few things. One, you might consider talking with editors specifically, and noting that there are different kinds of editors and different kinds of publishing houses. So the place to start is I think at your bookshelf, and determine, the kinds of presses that you enjoy reading, or the work from the presses you enjoy reading, and maybe check on the website for some names and contacts and introduce yourself. I did that myself. I was a graduate student in literature, and I took a year off because I wasn't feeling it. And I took a publishing certificate at the university now known as Toronto Metropolitan University. And one of the courses was a scholarly publishing course. And I suddenly realized, oh, right, somebody's out there creating these books that I've been reading for years. That sounds fun. And I also learned in the course of taking those classes, but you don't have to take the classes to know this, that there are copy editors, and there are substantive editors, and there are developmental editors, and there's scholarly publishing and textbook publishing and trade publishing. So, do a bit of research, which you'll know how to do, and don't hesitate to reach out to people like me who are in the business and ask questions. I certainly benefited from conversations like that with people in the industry before I found myself in it. So I'd be happy to have conversations with others.
Darcy or Teresa, do either of you want to add to that? Talk a little bit about your past.
Got my heater going here. It's very cold in Iowa. I'm probably not the best person, just because I haven't actually worked in the publishing industry. It's very different when you're a series editor. Although I will say that I think it's worth looking around to see if there are internships available for graduate students. That a summer internship, often they're paid internships, or even during the year if your life allows. That can be a wonderful way to learn about kinds of editorial work. And also, I think if you've only been a student, it's hard to understand the kind of collaborative, complex environment other workspaces are, and many people find that delightful once they experience it. But you would be a much stronger candidate applying for a press, being able to speak from any kind of position of existing experience in a press. So even credit bearing instead of paid internships could be one great way to begin to get that experience and enter that world and those networks.
I think I echo largely what's been said about the networks. There's editors associations that you can join, which gives you resources and conversations you can have with people and can get you those first contracts. There are courses that you can take, but there's a lot of informal learning. There's a lot of opportunity, and publishing really is very, exactly, people want to work together. They want to bring in new talent, and skills and ideas. And so it really is finding your place, as Siobhan said. There's so many different possibilities. If you're looking to be, a substantive editor, that's going to look a little bit different, but exposure to every part of it and understanding of different publishing sectors, because they are very different. It's hard to make that change if you've been in trade publishing for 5 years to go into scholarly publishing or educational publishing. It's not impossible, but I think getting that exposure and talking with others and seeing those opportunities of work. There's word on the street, there's events that you can volunteer at. I think just finding your way in, there's a lot of different possibilities.
And one other thing that occurred to me as Darcy was speaking is often in a department, if you're a graduate student, there are journals that are published out of your department, so that if they're, in many cases, they have a mixture of teaching or graduate assistantships and just working for, being one of the student readers for the first round of reading articles before they go out to the external readers. So there are ways, if you have a journal in your department, I would say go talk to the journal editor and say, are there ways I can be involved? Obviously, if it's a paid teaching assistantship, that's wonderful. But that's a great way to get even a picture of what workflow and looks like in publication.
And additionally, I would say if you don't have access to a journal or some kind of publication, the faculty around you may be working on book manuscripts, journal articles. They may need assistance on an editorial level, and they may have the funds to pay for that. So you could also, by word of mouth or whatever form of advertising you might want to try, speaking with your fellow faculty members and or supervisor, etc. networks about part-time work as an editor, with the understanding that you're getting your feet wet, but it is experience that you then have to use as a way to get a foot in the door.
Thanks.
And that's something we're working on. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add that something we're working on right now is the fact that freelance is a big part of the labor in publishing, and informal networks tend to be quite common. That's something we're working on as a publishing community, is to how do we break outside of some or open up those informal networks. And so, for example, there's the Editors Association, but now there's the Indigenous Editors Association. And so I think, contacting people and trying to build those up, I think there'll be more visibility, hopefully, about how to get to that foot in the door.
Thanks, everyone. That's great. And there's some great links now in the chat that Darcy and then also some participants have put up related to scholarly editing. If you're at UBC graduate student, I'll add that the UBC Faculty of Arts publishes a number of journals, including BC Studies, which I edit. And we do often hire graduate students who help us with book reviews and who have an opportunity then to see, not just with book reviews, a variety of roles at the journal are often filled by students at UBC. So that's another place to look. I'd like to thank all of you again for taking time and sharing all your expertise and thoughts with us today. And what we're going to do now, I want to ask the participants, please don't leave. We're going to move into the next section of our event today. And we're going to have breakout rooms that people have signed up for ahead of time. So please don't log off Zoom. We're going to take a 10-minute break now. And then that will allow Sydney time to make the breakout rooms that people signed up for ahead of time. And you'll have a chance to talk about your own particular specific project ideas with one of the editors.